What if I told you that one of the greatest economic disasters in human history didn't begin with war, destruction, or scarcity, but with something far more seductive: hope, ambition, and the illusion that wealth could grow forever? That for nearly a decade, an entire nation believed it had discovered the secret to endless prosperity, a system where money seemed to multiply on its own, where ordinary people could become rich almost overnight, where risk felt like a myth and success felt inevitable, and yet in just a matter of days, that illusion collapsed so violently that it wiped out fortunes, destroyed banks, shattered families, and pushed millions into despair, a collapse so deep that it would reshape not only the United States, but the entire world for decades to come. Because to understand how something like this could happen, we need to go back to a moment when everything seemed to be going perfectly right, a moment right after the end of the First World War, when the world was exhausted, broken, and financially devastated. But while Europe struggled to rebuild cities, economies, and entire societies, the United States found itself in a completely different position, rising as a global power stronger than ever before, with industries booming, cities expanding, and a population ready to consume like never before, creating what became known as the American dream, a vision of life where prosperity was not just possible, but expected, where owning a car, a house, and modern appliances became symbols of success, where innovation moved fast and the future felt limitless. And during the 1920s, this vision turned into reality at a speed the world had never seen before. Factories produced goods in massive quantities. Cars filled the streets. Radios connected millions of people to the same information at the same time, and cinema transformed entertainment into a cultural force, shaping behavior, desire, and identity. And all of this created an environment where people didn't just want to live, they wanted to live better, faster, and richer. And that desire became one of the driving forces behind what would eventually lead to disaster. Because this new way of life wasn't just built on production, it was built on consumption. And consumption needed one key ingredient to grow without limits: credit. The idea that you didn't need to have money to spend money, that you could buy something today and worry about paying for it later. And this concept spread rapidly across the country, making it possible for millions of people to access goods they could never afford before, turning spending into a habit and debt into something normal. And at first, this system worked incredibly well because as long as people kept buying, companies kept growing, jobs kept existing, and money kept circulating, reinforcing the belief that the system was stable, that it was safe, that it would continue expanding forever. But what most people didn't realize was that this growth was becoming increasingly fragile because it depended on constant confidence, constant belief, and constant expansion. And the moment any of those elements started to fail, everything would begin to collapse. And nowhere was this illusion stronger than in the stock market, where investing transformed from a financial activity into a cultural phenomenon, something that attracted not just wealthy businessmen, but ordinary citizens, workers, families, and even people with little to no understanding of how the market actually worked, because the idea was simple and incredibly powerful: buy a stock today, wait for its price to rise, and sell it for a profit. And since prices had been rising consistently for years, it created a sense of certainty, a belief that the market could only go in one direction, up. And this belief was amplified by newspapers, by financial institutions, and by influential figures who constantly reinforced the idea that investing was the smartest path to wealth. turning the stock market into something almost sacred in American culture, a place where fortunes were made and where dreams seemed to become reality. But behind this growing excitement, there was a dangerous shift happening, because instead of investing based on real value, people began to speculate, buying stocks not because companies were strong or profitable, but because they believed prices would continue rising. And this difference, although subtle, was critical, because speculation disconnects price from reality, inflating values beyond what they are actually worth, creating a bubble that grows larger and more unstable over time. And as more people entered the market, driven by fear of missing out and the desire to get rich quickly, this bubble expanded even faster, supported by another risky practice that became extremely common during that period: buying stocks with borrowed money.
This meant that people were taking loans from banks to invest in the stock market, using money they didn't have in the hope that their profits would be enough to repay the debt and still generate income. And while this strategy worked perfectly during times of growth, it created a massive risk, because if stock prices dropped, investors wouldn't just lose their money, they would still owe the banks, turning a simple loss into a financial disaster. And by the end of the 1920s, this practice had reached extreme levels, with the majority of stocks being purchased using credit, meaning that the entire market was built on a foundation of debt, speculation, and overconfidence, a combination that is incredibly powerful when things are going well, but devastating when they are not. At the center of all of this was Wall Street, controlled by a small group of powerful bankers and financial elites who understood how the system worked and who benefited enormously from it, because they didn't just participate in the market, they influenced it, shaping narratives, controlling access, and in some cases manipulating prices to maintain the illusion of stability. And while they publicly defended the idea that the market was self-regulating, that it didn't need government intervention, they were also the ones who stood to gain the most from keeping the system exactly as it was, and this lack of regulation allowed risky practices to grow unchecked, creating an environment where profits were prioritized over stability and where warning signs were ignored or dismissed. And there were warnings, voices that pointed out the dangers, economists, bankers, and analysts who recognized that the market was growing too fast, that prices were too high, that the system was unstable. But these warnings were largely ignored, because during times of prosperity people don't want to hear about risks, they want to believe that success will continue, that growth is permanent, that everything is under control. And this collective mindset played a crucial role in what happened next, because it delayed any action that could have prevented or at least softened the collapse. Then came 1929, and with it, the moment when confidence began to crack, slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, but enough to trigger a chain reaction that would change everything, because in a system built on belief, the moment people begin to doubt is the moment the system starts to fail. And on October 24th, known as Black Thursday, that doubt became visible, as the stock market experienced a sharp drop, causing panic among investors who rushed to sell their shares, trying to protect what they could before prices fell even further. But as more people tried to sell, prices dropped faster, creating a feedback loop of fear where each action intensified the next, and suddenly the unstoppable market revealed its true nature: fragile, unstable, and completely dependent on confidence. Crowds gathered outside financial institutions, desperate for information, watching in disbelief as the system they trusted began to collapse, while inside, bankers attempted to contain the crisis, injecting massive amounts of money into the market to stabilize prices and restore confidence. And for a brief moment it seemed to work, slowing and creating the illusion that the situation was under control. But that stability was temporary, because the underlying problems remained, and just a few days later the market collapsed again, this time with even greater force. On October 28th and 29th, that accelerated dramatically, wiping out billions of dollars in value, destroying savings, investments, and entire fortunes in a matter of hours, leaving behind a devastated population that suddenly realized that the system they believed in was built on illusions. And as the stock market fell, the consequences quickly spread beyond Wall Street, affecting banks,
businesses, and ordinary citizens, because when investors couldn't repay their loans, banks began to
fail, and when banks failed, people lost their savings, creating a wave of panic that spread across the country, with thousands rushing to withdraw their money, only to discover that it was no longer there. This created a financial domino effect that brought the entire economy to its knees. Businesses closed, unemployment soared, and millions of people found themselves without income, without security, and without hope. And what began as a market crash quickly turned into a full-scale economic depression, one of the most severe in modern history, lasting for years and affecting not just the United States but the entire global economy, as countries that depended on American trade and investment were also pulled into the crisis. As the situation worsened, the limitations of the existing system became clear, because the government initially failed to respond effectively, hesitant to interfere in the economy, allowing the crisis to deepen and prolonging the suffering of millions. But eventually change became unavoidable, leading to new policies, new regulations, and a new approach to economic management, marking a turning point in how governments interacted with markets, recognizing that without oversight and control, even the most prosperous systems can collapse under their own weight. And in the end, what makes the story of the 1929 crash so powerful is not just the scale of the disaster, but the lesson behind it, because it shows how quickly success can turn into failure when driven by unchecked ambition, how belief can sustain a system just as easily as doubt can destroy it, and how the pursuit of endless growth without understanding its limits can lead to consequences that affect generations, proving that sometimes the greatest collapses don't come from external forces, but from within the very systems we trust the most.